As John said, I'm Donna Seaman. I'm a senior editor at Booklist, which is published by the American Library Association here in Chicago. And I have a particular passion for the kind of books we'll be speaking about today, narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction, particularly about place. And I've named this program A Sense of Place, Rural and Urban. I'm powerfully drawn to books about land and culture and the self and the way we live. And those are the types of books we'll be talking about today, excuse me. Julene Bair, to my right, as is David, writes about her life on and off her family's Kansas farm. Her first book was the award-winning essay collection 1 Degree West, and her work has appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and several anthologies, among other places. Julene is taught at the universities of Wyoming and Iowa, and her new book is The Ogallala Road, a memoir of love and reckoning. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And David Giffels is here from Akron, Ohio. He teaches there at the University of Akron. It's his hometown, his whole life, hometown, and the subject of both of his books. His first book was All the Way Home, and his second book, which we'll be talking about today, is The Hard Way on Purpose, Essays and Dispatches from the Rust Belt. His essays also appear in a variety of places, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you, David, for being here. Thank you. Now, I thought I'd begin with a subject that might not come to mind when you think of place, and that is aesthetics, namely our sense of beauty. And this does attach us to things in many cases. And Julene, at the start of your book, you're searching for the bed of a creek in western Kansas that you remember from your childhood. And you're describing the high, dry plains landscape as it once was, and you write, "Our sense of beauty is a survival instinct." Of course, I just lost my place. A survival instinct telling us that a place can sustain us for generations to come. Now, not everyone thinks of the High Plains as exactly beautiful. Can you tell us about this landscape and why it's a matter of survival to find beauty?
Okay, well, first of all, like any western, wide open place, you can't really see it from the interstate. It's important to get off the interstate and drive down a gravel road at the very least, not asphalt, and then get out of your car. But of course, it also helps if you're on native grass, which is harder and harder to find these days. The native grass was its own ecosystem. It supported 50 to 70 million bison, along with the water that flowed in those places. The grass was it was very beautiful. It was a mild green color, and when you looked out across that grass, it had this sort of eternal aspect to it. Seemed eternal, like the sky. These two complemented each other aesthetically, but that grass, once it was plowed under, was no longer able to sustain life as it had in the past. And the same with the water. Once you pump the groundwater out from under a place, then the streams can no longer flow.
Exactly. We'll talk more about water as we go along. Now, David, you write about Akron, the rubber capital of the world, a place built on tires, basically. The industry has closed up there. It epitomizes the Rust Belt. Many buildings have been abandoned, and yet throughout your book, you go into somewhat rhapsodic descriptions of ruins, basically. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and I think as important as place is to a writer's sense of what it's writing about, it's the time that you experience it. And so there's a word that I use in my book that I actually lifted from another source, but it was used once to describe Akron in its industrial heyday as unbeautiful, which is a word I really love because it's a word that it doesn't mean ugly. It means a different kind of beautiful. And so the city that I experienced or kind of came into an understanding of was just at the moment of collapse. And so as a young person interested in exploring my city for the first time in my college years, it was, Akron was for a short time, almost like Beirut. I mean, just a completely abandoned downtown full of buildings that were in decay. And for me to be young enough and naive enough not to recognize the economic and social implications of that, but just to find these places that were like this abandoned playground, it was like, happening onto the back lot of a Hollywood studio. And so my friends and I would break into old factories, and we would explore the old canal and behind the alleyways behind the buildings that were all empty. And so to me, it was just full of possibility, and you could do anything here, and nobody wants it. We can have all of this. And so it felt like this early reclamation for us. So to me, that was all nothing but exciting, and I still think of those landscapes as very beautiful in an unbeautiful sort of way.
It's very interesting. So we're talking about places that have undergone serious change. Akron was sort of built and then abandoned by industry. Western Kansas, which for millennia had a way of sustaining life, including farming, and then was industrialized and ran into all kinds of problems. So I wonder if you could sort of talk about the changes that happened there. And the other theme you two share is adversity, that people really have to struggle to live in these places. So if you could talk about that.
Well, when I was growing up, we were livestock ranchers and dryland farmers. The word dryland farming, according to this historian, Walter Prescott Webb, who wrote about the Great Plains, is the science of farming where rainfall is deficient. We got 17 inches of rain a year where I grew up. So we had to be really scientists and artists at maintaining that moisture in our soil. So that combination of grasslands and dryland winter wheat, those two crops were quite beautiful. One was not really a crop, it was just what had always been there, but what we grew on it was a crop. In our case, it was 1,000 head of sheep, who each year would have 1,200 lambs up there or thereabouts. And it was a very sensuous or sensory existence with a lot of wildlife around us, much of which we would catch and try to tame. And every domestic animal under the sun, and our own family, which we had our own variety of wildlife within our family. And I grew up in a way of life, really. But when irrigation development came to our area, then farmers realized that they could make 3 times as much because they could get 3 times the crop with irrigation water. So they started mining the Ogallala aquifer, which is the groundwater under the Great Plains, all the way from southern South Dakota to North Texas. And I watched the landscape become gradually industrialized and more of the prairie grass farmed under.
Indeed. David, you write a lot about living the hard way, and an interesting part of your essays is what difficulties do in terms of building character. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the Akron character that you find inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, there's a time, there's a time every year around this time of year when we believe for real that the Indians are going to win the World Series. And just as that starts to fade, the Cleveland Browns start training camp. And so there's this really, this terrible cycle of life for people who've lived in that region for the past 50 years, which is how long it's been since we won anything, where this hope that cycles around, so there's quite a bit of sports in the book that's not really about sports at all, but it's a great metaphor for the kind of people who stick it out in places like that, because Akron, Ohio, in the 1960s, the decade I was born, its population peaked at nearly 300,000, and it's now just under 200,000, so a third of the population is left. People who stay and commit to a place like that commit with this kind of hardscrabble hope, because it's much, the title is The Hard Way on Purpose. It's much easier to move, even to Chicago. A lot of the out-migration from those Midwestern Rust Belt cities came to Chicago, which was this great metropolis that's still a similar kind of vibe, of an industrial Midwestern vibe. But those who stay, take a certain kind of pride in, doing it that way. And, and I think it's, you can be prouder to be a perennial fan of the Cleveland Indians than, you know, even the